Morning of my stroke, my daughter was already packed for Cancun. I remember lying on the kitchen floor, my right hand not doing what I told it to do, the coffee mug broken in pieces near the refrigerator. I'd knocked it off the counter when my arm went numb. I managed to get to my phone. I called her first, not 911, her, because that's what you do when something goes wrong. You call your child. She picked up on the third ring. Dad, I'm literally about to leave for the airport. I told her something was wrong. I told her I couldn't feel my right side. I told her I was on the floor. There was a pause. Then I heard her put her hand over the phone and say something to her husband, Neil. I couldn't make out the words. Then she came back. Dad, it might just be a pinched nerve. You've had those before. Can you call Mrs. Patterson next door? We're already running late, and if we miss this flight, we lose everything. The hotel deposit, the excursions, all of it. I said, Sweetheart, I think I'm having a stroke. Another pause. Are you sure? Because last time you said your arm was numb, it turned out to be how you slept. I hung up and called 911. The paramedic said if I'd waited another 20 minutes, the outcome would have been very different. That's what the younger one told me, a kid who couldn't have been more than 26 while they were loading me into the ambulance. You did the right thing calling us when you did, sir. I was 63 years old, lying on a gurney in my own driveway, thinking about the fact that my daughter was somewhere on I-95 headed to the airport while I was headed to the ICU. And I thought, well, now I know. Let me back up, because you need to understand what the years before that morning looked like. My wife, Carol Ann, passed away 11 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end. That's how fast it took her. After that, it was just me and my daughter Brooke and her husband Neil, who she'd married 3 years before Carol Ann got sick. I threw myself into work for a long time. I'd built a small commercial HVAC company over 30 years. Nothing glamorous, but honest work, and it had done well. By the time I sold it at 61, I had enough to be comfortable. More than comfortable if I'm being truthful. Brooke and Neil had been living in a 2-bedroom apartment in Raleigh. Neil worked in pharmaceutical sales, made decent money, but Brooke had left her marketing job when their son Oliver was born and hadn't gone back. They weren't struggling exactly, but they weren't building anything either. So when they mentioned they were thinking about buying a house, I offered to help with the down payment, $40,000. I wired it to them on a Tuesday without making them ask twice. That should have been the end of it. But then the house needed a new roof the following spring and I covered it. Then Neil's car transmission failed and I told him not to worry about it. Brooke mentioned Oliver's preschool had a waiting list, but the priority spots went to families who made a larger annual donation, so I wrote the check. I wasn't keeping score. Thief! I genuinely wasn't keeping score, because they were my family and I had the means, and it made me feel useful, the way fathers need to feel useful when their children are grown and gone. By the time I added up now, and I have added it up now, I'd given them somewhere around $4,000 a month for 3 years, not in one check, just in the constant drip of this thing and that thing, and of course, Dad, it's fine. It just became the water we all swam in. The Cancun trip, I should tell you, I had also paid for. All-inclusive resort, a week. I gave them the money as a Christmas gift. I thought they needed a vacation. I thought they deserved a break. So when my daughter told me she couldn't miss that flight, the flight I had paid for, to the resort I had paid for, I want you to understand the full picture of what that meant. I spent 4 days in the hospital. The stroke was mild as strokes go. A TIA is what they called it, a transient ischemic attack, but it left me with some fatigue, some difficulty with word finding, and a strong recommendation from my neurologist to reduce stress and have consistent support at home during recovery. I would need help for at least 6 to 8 weeks. Nothing permanent, just someone around. I had a lot of time to think in that hospital room. Brooke called on day 2. She and Neil had landed in Cancun, and she'd gotten my text. I'd sent one from the ambulance, just, at hospital TIA stable, enjoy your trip. And she was calling to check in. Oh, Dad, I'm so relieved it wasn't worse. A TIA is basically like a warning stroke, right? So your brain is telling you to slow down. Maybe this is actually a blessing in disguise. A blessing in disguise. Those were her exact words. Neil got on the phone briefly to say he was really glad I was okay and that he'd been researching and TIAs often had full and complete recovery. He sounded like he was reading from a WebMD article while also looking at a pool menu. I could hear steel drum music in the background. I told him I need some help when I got home. 6 to 8 weeks, the doctor said. Just someone around in case. Brooke said, "We'll absolutely figure something out when we get back. Neil's mom might be able to come stay. Or maybe there's a service, like a home health aid thing. I'll look into it." I said, "That's fine. I'll handle it." And I did. I called a home care agency the next morning and arranged for a woman named Gloria to come 5 days a week, starting when I was discharged. Gloria was 54, originally from Honduras, and had been doing home health work for 20 years. She was calm and competent and made the best arroz con pollo I'd ever eaten, which she brought sometimes in a container and heated up on the stove without being asked. Within 2 weeks, I looked forward to her arriving every morning more than I looked forward to most things. Brooke and Neil came to see me once in that first month. A Sunday afternoon, they brought Oliver, who was 5, and who spent the whole visit asking if I had any cookies and whether my television was the kind you can talk to. They stayed 2 hours and 40 minutes. I know because I looked at the clock when they left. The conversation, such as it was, included Neil mentioning 3 times that he was up for a regional sales director position and was pretty confident he'd get it. Brooke talked about a kitchen renovation they were thinking about. Nothing crazy, just the backsplash and maybe the counters. She said she'd been getting quotes and the range was kind of shocking. She didn't ask how I was sleeping. She didn't ask what the doctors had said about long-term risk. She didn't ask whether I was scared. I was scared. I hadn't told anyone that, but I was. A stroke, even a small one, changes the way you relate to your body. You stop trusting it. You lie in bed at night and you notice every little thing. The slight headache, the moment of dizziness when you stand up too fast. You don't know if the next one will be different. You don't know if there will be a next one. I was 63 years old, and I had sold my company, and I had money in the bank, and I was lying awake at 3 in the morning, wondering if my brain was going to fail me in my sleep, and my daughter was getting quotes for marble countertops. About 6 weeks into my recovery, I got a letter. I want to tell you about this letter. It came through a law office in Raleigh. It was a petition for guardianship filed by my daughter and her husband on the grounds that I was, and I'm quoting directly, experiencing cognitive decline that impairs his ability to manage his financial and personal affairs. Cognitive decline. I sat at my kitchen table with that letter for a long time. Gloria was in the other room. I didn't say anything to her. I just sat with it. The petition cited my stroke as evidence of my deteriorating condition. It cited what they called my pattern of impulsive financial gifting as further evidence. It cited a conversation, a private conversation I'd had with Brooke 2 years ago when I said, in passing, that I sometimes felt like I was giving too much away and maybe needed to think more carefully about money, as evidence that I myself had acknowledged uncertainty regarding financial decision-making. They had built a case out of my generosity and my one moment of self-doubt. If the petition succeeded, they would have legal authority over my finances, over my healthcare decisions, over everything. I had a very good attorney. I want to say that because it matters. I'd used him for the business sale, and he was sharp, and he was unimpressed by the petition the moment he read it. "This is thin," he said. "Very thin. You're going to be fine. But we're going to have to respond." We responded. I underwent a full neuropsychological evaluation. 3 hours, every kind of cognitive test you can imagine. The results came back, no cognitive impairment. Above average executive function for my age group. The evaluating psychologist wrote in her report that I demonstrated strong insight, intact judgment, and no evidence of any decline in decision-making capacity. The petition was dismissed. Now, here is where I want to be precise, because I've thought about this more than I've thought about almost anything in my life, and I want to get it right. I did not act out of anger. I want to be clear about that. What I felt, sitting at that kitchen table, was not exactly anger. It was something more like clarity, the kind of clarity you only get when something strips away every last thing you were pretending not to see. I called my financial advisor that same week. I restructured everything, the monthly help I'd been providing, which had continued even during my recovery, because I hadn't stopped it, because I was still, even then, being their father. I stopped. All of it. One phone call to my bank, done. I updated my will. I established a trust for my grandson Oliver, structured so that the funds would be managed by an independent trustee and dispersed to him when he turned 25 for education and housing purposes, not to his parents, to him when he was old enough to use it the way it was intended. I did not call Brooke to tell her any of this. I didn't send a letter. I didn't have a conversation. I had learned, finally, at 63, after a stroke and a guardianship petition, that there was nothing left to say that would matter. She found out on a Friday morning. I know it was a Friday because Gloria was there and I was in the backyard, which I'd started sitting in every morning now that the weather was good. Doctor said fresh air and walking were the best things for me, and Gloria came to the back door and said, "Your phone's been ringing." I looked at it a little while later. 14 missed calls, a string of texts that got progressively less composed as they went. "Dad, the transfer didn't go through. Can you call me?" "Dad, I think there might be an error with your account. Please call when you can." "Dad, why isn't the payment going through? We have bills that are due." "Dad, please call me. This is important." "Dad, I don't understand what's happening." "Dad." Neil had also called twice. He didn't leave a message. Neil never left messages. Neil only dealt in things he could plausibly deny later. I put the phone down, and I finished my coffee. The yard was very green. We'd had a wet spring. There was a cardinal in the oak tree at the back fence, a male, bright red, sitting on the same branch he seemed to sit on every morning, and I thought about Carol Ann, who always loved cardinals, who used to say they were relatives checking in. I thought about what she would have said about all of this. I think she would have been heartbroken. I think she also would have told me I should have done it sooner. I didn't call Brooke back that day. I called her the following Monday, gave her 3 days to understand that the silence was not an accident. When she answered, her voice was tight in that way. Voices get when someone has been crying and doesn't want you to know. She said, "Dad, what's going on? Neil and I have been worried sick." I said, "Have you?" She said, "The payment stopped. We have a mortgage payment due in Oliver's school. I don't understand what happened." I said, "Nothing happened to the account. I made a decision." Long pause. "What kind of decision?" I decided to stop. To stop what? Brooke. I said her name the way her mother used to, when she wanted her to really hear something. "I got a letter from a law office 2 months ago. I think you know which one." The silence on the other end of that call was one of the longest silences I have ever sat with. She said finally, "Dad, that was Neil's idea. I want you to know that. I told him it was a mistake, but he said you were. He said he was worried, and I went along with it, and I shouldn't have, and I'm sorry." This is the part I want to talk about, because it matters. I believed her, part way. I believed that Neil had pushed for it. That fits what I know of Neil, the man who files paperwork as a first response, who treats problems like liability issues. But I also knew that Brooke had signed that petition. Her name was on it, and 3 years of watching her spend my money without ever once asking if I was all right, without ever once treating me like a person rather than a resource. That wasn't Neil. That was who she had allowed herself to become. And those are two different things. I told her I wasn't interested in having the conversation about whose idea it was. I told her I loved her. I told her I would always love her, because she was my daughter and that was not something I was capable of switching off, no matter how much I might want to some days. I told her that Oliver was protected in a trust that would take care of him when he was grown, and that he was never the one I was angry at. And then I told her that until I saw real evidence, not words, not apologies, but evidence, that things were different, I would need some distance. She cried. I let her cry. I didn't fill the silence with reassurance the way I used to. That was one of the things I had learned, that I used to rush to fill silences with reassurance, because it was uncomfortable to let my child be in pain. But sometimes the discomfort is the lesson. Sometimes you have to let the silence be what it is. Neil and Brooke listed their house 8 weeks later. The house I had provided the down payment for. I felt something when I heard that, though I couldn't quite name it. Not satisfaction. More like watching a knot finally come undone. From what Brooke told me later, there is always a later with your children, no matter what. Neil had been quietly over-leveraged for years. The pharmaceutical sales job had plateaued. He'd taken on debt I didn't know about. Without the monthly help I'd been providing, the math simply didn't work. They sold the house, paid off what they owed, and Neil got a job offer in Phoenix that he took. Partly because the cost of living was lower, and partly, I suspect, because Raleigh had become uncomfortable for him in ways that had my name on them. Brooke and Oliver didn't go to Phoenix. That was the part I hadn't expected. She called me on a Tuesday evening in October. I remember because the Cardinal had stopped coming to the yard by then. They go somewhere in the cold. And she said, "Dad, we separated. Neil is in Phoenix. Oliver and I are in a rental about 2 miles from you." I didn't say anything for a moment. She said, "I'm not calling to ask for anything. I needed you to know." There was something different in her voice. It's hard to describe. Like something she'd been holding at an angle for a long time had finally been set down flat. I told her I was glad she called. I told her I'd like to see Oliver when she was ready. She brought him over the following Saturday. He was taller. He'd started kindergarten. He spent an hour in my backyard looking for bugs under the stones near the fence and explaining their names to me with tremendous authority, most of which he had made up. Brooke and I sat on the back porch and we didn't talk about any of it. Not the petition, not the money, not Phoenix. We talked about whether Oliver might have his grandmother's stubbornness. He very much does, and about the neighborhood she'd moved to and whether the school was good. Small things. The things you talk about when you're learning how to be around someone again. Gloria was there that day. She'd been scaling back by then. I only needed her twice a week by that point. And she made coffee and brought it out to the porch without being asked. And Brooke looked at her and said thank you. And Gloria said, "He tells me about you." And I saw something move across my daughter's face that I think was shame or the beginning of understanding, which is sometimes the same thing. I am 64 years old now. I do not give anyone $4,000 a month. I sit in my backyard in the mornings and I watch for the Cardinal, and some days he comes and some days he doesn't, and either way I am still here, which is not nothing. Oliver comes over on Saturdays when Brooke doesn't have other plans. He has graduated from backyard bobs to wanting to know how the HVAC unit works, which I find deeply gratifying. Last week he asked me if I would teach him. I told him we'd start in the spring, when the weather was warm enough to be outside, and he accepted this with great seriousness and wrote it down in a small notebook he carries, which made me laugh in a way that surprised me. The sudden, involuntary kind, the kind you'd forgotten was still in you. I think about what I would tell a man in the position I was in 3 years ago. A man who keeps giving because it feels like love. A man who tells himself the story that generosity and being needed are the same thing. I would tell him, you can love your child with everything you have and still refuse to disappear into them. You can grieve what you wish the relationship had been and still protect what remains of the life you built. You can leave a door open, quietly, without announcement, and let them find it on their own time. That's the best I've got. It's not a tidy answer, but I'm 64 and I had a stroke and I sat at a kitchen table holding a guardianship petition with my daughter's name on it, and I'm still here. And some mornings that feels like enough. Some mornings it feels like more than enough. I keep coming back to the moment I was on the kitchen floor, phone in my hand, calling my daughter before I called 911. That tells you everything you need to know about where I was, not just physically, but in my own mind. I had spent so many years making myself available, making myself useful, making myself the person they could count on, that even when my brain was misfiring and my right arm had gone numb, my first instinct was still to reach toward them. That's not love. Or rather, it started as love, and somewhere along the way it became a habit I confused for love. There's a difference, and it took a guardianship petition with my daughter's signature on it for me to finally see it. What I've come to understand is that the consequences in this story weren't punishment. Nobody handed them down. They just followed, the way water follows a slope. Brooke and Neil had been building toward that outcome for years. Every time they took without asking whether I was okay, every time they spent without wondering what it cost me, every time they treated my generosity as a given rather than a gift. The petition was just the moment the slope ran out. You can only drift in a direction for so long before you arrive somewhere. And I had my own reckoning, too. I wasn't blameless. A man with real clarity about his own worth doesn't quietly fund a lifestyle for 3 years while telling himself it's fine. I told myself a story about what good fathers do, and I used that story to avoid a harder conversation. That's not wisdom. That's avoidance dressed up in generosity. The stroke didn't just warn me about my blood pressure. It warned me about that. What changed me wasn't anger. It was something I can only describe as finally deciding to think clearly, to look at what was actually in front of me rather than what I wished was there. Gloria, who showed up every morning and did her job with more dignity than most people bring to their closest relationships. She showed me what it looks like when someone simply does right by another person without needing an audience for it. There's a kind of quiet integrity in that. I hadn't seen it up close in a while. The strength it took, and I want to name it as strength, because people don't always, was in the stillness, not in cutting off the payments, which took one phone call, but in sitting with the silence afterward, in not calling Brooke back the same day, in not rushing to explain myself or soften the edges of what I'd done. Every instinct I had said, fix this, smooth it over, be the bigger person in the way that actually means be the smaller person. I didn't. That was the hardest thing I've done in recent memory. Brooke is different now. Not fixed. People don't get fixed, but different. Something got set down that she'd been carrying at the wrong angle for too long. I see it in how she sits on the back porch. I see it in how she talks to Oliver. I don't know what her life looks like in 10 years, but I think she's building something real now, in a way she wasn't before. Oliver wrote it in his notebook. Learn the HVAC. Spring. He underlined it twice. I'm 64. I had a small stroke and I sat at a kitchen table with a legal document that tried to tell me I couldn't think for myself. And I'm still here, planning to teach my grandson how the machinery works when the weather gets warm. That's enough. Most days it's more than enough.